In 1970, performance was judged by noise, displacement, and intimidation. If a car didn't rumble, shake, or burn rubber on command, it wasn't taken seriously. So when a small Japanese sedan showed up with just 96 horsepower and a simple carburetor, no one bothered to look twice. It didn't threaten egos, reputations, or podiums, at least not on paper. But racing history has a habit of punishing assumptions. What followed wasn't a fluke or a lucky win. It was a quiet, methodical humiliation that rewrote what fast really meant. The economy box deception. Picture the American street scene in 1970. The air is thick with the smell of unburnt leaded gasoline and the raw heat radiating off asphalt. The soundtrack of the era is defined by the heavy, rhythmic loping of massive V8 engines idling at stoplights. This was the zenith of the muscle car age, a time when the big three in Detroit were locked in an arms race of displacement. Dealers were pushing Chevelle SS 454S and Hemi Cudas, machines that measured performance in straight-line violence and weighed nearly 2 tons. In this world, presence was physical. Value was determined by the pound and the cubic inch. Now imagine the vehicle sitting unnoticed in the shadow of those giants. It is a small, upright sedan with skinny tires and a polite hum that is barely audible over the rumble of the lane next to it. This is the Datsun 510. To the average enthusiast gripping the wheel of a GTO, this little import was not just different, it was invisible. You have to understand the specific arrogance of the American automotive market at this time. The prevailing consumer logic was absolute. Bigger was inherently better, and small was synonymous with weak. A car with a 1.6-liter engine was viewed with the same enthusiasm as a lawnmower. The cultural mindset dictated that a real car needed a long hood, a short deck, and enough torque to alter the rotation of the Earth. Anything less was just a toy, something you settled for rather than aspired to. This dismissal was compounded by a widespread stigma regarding Japanese manufacturing. In 1970, the phrase "made in Japan" did not yet command respect in the automotive sector. For many, these vehicles were seen as the penalty box of the automotive world. They were viewed as utilitarian appliances akin to a toaster or a washing machine, soulless metal boxes designed for basic transportation and nothing more. The expectation was that they were cheap, tinny, and disposable. You drove them until the rust took over, which everyone assumed would happen quickly, and then you scrapped them. Teruo Uchino, the man responsible for the 510's exterior, crafted a design that unintentionally reinforced this prejudice. The car was undeniably attractive in a clean, minimalist way, but it was also unapologetically boxy. It featured an upright greenhouse, thin pillars, and simple chrome hubcaps that screamed economy class. It lacked the aggressive curves or intimidation factor that American buyers associated with performance. It looked like a European sedan stripped of its prestige, a design that allowed it to vanish completely into the background of suburban traffic. The skepticism was so deep that it transcended borders. Even in markets like Australia, where the car was sold as the Datsun 1600, the buying public was genuinely confused. The 510 offered advanced specifications, overhead cams, independent suspension, at a price point that undercut the competition significantly. Instead of seeing a bargain, buyers became suspicious. The logic of the era suggested that if a car offered this much specification for so little money, the engineering must be cut rate. People looked at the sticker price and assumed there had to be a catch. Mr. K's calculated strike. But while America was building heavy iron hammers, a man named Yutaka Katayama was quietly sharpening a scalpel. This car was not the result of some happy accident or a fluke of mass production. It was a calculated precision strike orchestrated by one of the most rebellious figures in automotive history. Known to the world as Mr. K, Katayama was the president of Nissan USA, but he was far from a typical corporate suit. He was a rogue executive who despised boring cars with a visceral passion. He understood something his superiors back in Japan did not. For a Japanese brand to survive in the United States, it couldn't just offer cheap transportation. It needed a soul. Katayama was fighting a war on 2 fronts. In America, he faced a market addicted to horsepower. In Japan, he faced a conservative corporate culture at Nissan that was paralyzed by the fear of failure. The executives in Tokyo wanted to build safe, conventional appliances that wouldn't offend anyone. Mr. K wanted to build a legend. He saw a specific gap in the market that no one else was addressing. He noticed that American roads were beginning to see nimble European machines, specifically the BMW 1600. He realized there was a massive untapped demographic of drivers who had Oktoberfest dreams, but a Budweiser budget. These were enthusiasts who craved the tactile feedback and handling of a German sports sedan, but simply couldn't afford the admission price. Mr. K's vision was radical. He lobbied Nissan leadership to develop a four-door sports car that could win on Sunday and sell on Monday. This was a massive departure from the company's previous strategy of economy above all else. He demanded a car that didn't just function, but communicated. He wanted a chassis that could dance and an engine that liked to rev. To achieve this, Nissan didn't just look at the BMW 1600, they dissected it. They reverse-engineered the German sedan to understand the physics of its handling, its poise under pressure, and the mechanical transparency that made it feel alive. Katayama returned to Japan with a non-negotiable mandate: build a car that drives like a BMW, but costs as much as a Volkswagen. However, ambition requires engineering, and this is where the story takes a turn that most people overlook. The secret weapon of the Datsun 510 wasn't actually a Datsun innovation at all. It came from a 1966 merger with the Prince Motor Company. Prince was a smaller Japanese manufacturer, but they possessed a level of engineering sophistication that Datsun lacked. Crucially, Prince engineers had spent years building engines under license from Mercedes-Benz. They had mastered the art of high-performance cylinder heads and durable valve trains. When Prince merged with Nissan, they brought this European DNA with them. The influence is unmistakable in the Datsun L-Series engine. If you look closely at the valve train and the cylinder head design, you see the ghosts of Mercedes engineering. This merger allowed Nissan to skip entire generations of trial and error. Instead of starting from scratch, they inherited a blueprint for durability and performance that had been refined by one of the best engineering firms in the world. This was the shortcut that made the 510 possible. The resulting package was an engineering marvel disguised as a budget sedan. The goal was to hit a price point of $1,996. That was less than $1 per pound. For that price, Katayama promised a car with an overhead cam engine, tech that was usually reserved for exotics, and a four-wheel independent suspension system to rival the best Europe had to offer. The plan was to lure buyers in with the price of a Beetle and then shock them with the heart of a racer. It was a Trojan horse strategy designed to infiltrate the American driveway by offering a driving experience that simply shouldn't have been possible for the money. The 96 horsepower myth. Open the hood of a 1970 Datsun 510 in a parking lot full of muscle cars, and you could practically hear the laughter. 96 horsepower. That was the number stamped on the spec sheet. To a generation raised on big block V80s churning out 400 foot-pounds of torque, 96 horsepower wasn't just low, it was insulting. A decent blender had more power, or so the joke went. But this number was the greatest deception in automotive history, a figure that completely masked the mechanical brilliance hiding between the fenders. The engine sitting in that bay, the L16, was not your standard economy lump. While American manufacturers were still welding heavy iron pushrod engines into their compact cars, Datsun was delivering something that belonged on a racetrack. The L16 featured an aluminum cylinder head with a single overhead camshaft. In 1970, an overhead cam was exotic technology for a car at this price point. It allowed for better airflow, higher engine speeds, and a level of responsiveness that pushrod engines simply couldn't match. But the real magic was in the bottom end. The block was a special monoblock casting with deep skirting, designed for immense structural rigidity. Inside, the crankshaft was a piece of art. It was forged steel, and crucially, it was supported by 5 main bearings. This is the detail that separates a disposable engine from a legendary one. Most economy engines of the time ran on 3 main bearings, which was cheaper but limited how fast you could spin the engine before the crankshaft started to flex and self-destruct. The L16's 5-bearing support system meant the bottom end was virtually bulletproof. You could take this weak 96 horsepower engine and scream it all the way to 7,000 revolutions per minute, and it would just ask for more. It was overbuilt to a degree that bordered on financial irresponsibility for an economy car. Then there was the fuel delivery. The US models came with a single Hitachi downdraft 2-barrel carburetor. On the surface, it looked like a simple utilitarian mixing valve, but in practice, it was a masterclass in response. Unlike the massive 4-barrel carburetors on American V80s that would bog down if you looked at them wrong, the Hitachi was crisp. It was perfectly matched to the engine's displacement dimensions, an 83mm bore and a 73.7mm stroke. This nearly square geometry meant the engine loved to rev, and the carburetor was tuned to deliver fuel instantly the moment you touched the pedal. So, while the muscle car drivers were laughing at the double-digit horsepower figure, they were missing the equation of mechanical harmony. The Datsun 510 weighed barely 2,100 pounds. When you do the math, 96 horsepower in a chassis that light is a completely different experience than 300 horsepower in a 4,000-pound barge. The 510 didn't have to fight its own mass. It didn't need massive torque to get moving, because there was nothing to move. The power-to-weight ratio allowed it to keep up with traffic effortlessly, and the close ratio 4-speed manual transmission kept that screaming L16 right in the sweet spot. It wasn't about the size of the number, it was about how effectively you could use it. And as the world was about to find out, 96 horsepower is plenty when you don't have to slow down for the corners. Handling that shocked the world. But then came the first corner, and that is where the laughter stopped. When the Datsun 510 hit the winding roads of American canyons and the test tracks of major automotive journals, it initiated a David versus Goliath moment that no one saw coming. In a straight line, the muscle cars were kings. But the moment the road turned, the 510 didn't just keep up, it embarrassed them. The secret lay in a suspension setup that was radically sophisticated for a budget car of 1970. While American competitors and even most fellow Japanese imports were still bouncing around on solid live rear axles, heavy iron beams connecting the rear wheels that would skip and shudder over every bump, the 510 was different. It utilized a fully independent rear suspension with semi-trailing arms. This was technology usually reserved for high-end European sedans. It meant that when one rear wheel hit a pothole or a bump mid-corner, it absorbed the impact independently without upsetting the other wheel. The car remained planted, maintaining contact with the asphalt, where a Mustang or a Camaro would have been skittering sideways. But the real magic of the 510 wasn't just that it was stable, it was how it rotated. The engineering behind the semi-trailing arm suspension created a specific handling characteristic known as trailing throttle oversteer. It sounds technical, but it is actually a beautiful dance of physics. Here is how it worked. Imagine you are charging into a corner hard. The suspension loads up. Just as you turn the wheel, you sharply lift your foot off the gas pedal. In a normal car, this might just slow you down. In the 510, the sudden weight transfer to the front unloads the rear suspension. Because of the unique angle of the trailing arms, as the rear wheels lift slightly, they physically steer outward, a phenomenon called toe out. This creates a pivoting effect. The rear of the car swings gently toward the outside of the turn, pointing the nose aggressively toward the apex. It allowed a skilled driver to steer the car with the throttle pedal as much as the steering wheel. This ability to rotate on command was a trait associated with the Porsche 911, not a cheap Japanese sedan. This behavior turned the 510 into a momentum machine. While the heavy American iron had to stomp on the brakes to avoid plowing off the road, the lightweight Datsun could carry incredible speed through the bend. It was the difference between fighting physics and using it to your advantage. The automotive press was left reeling. The editors at Road and Track and Car and Driver were stunned. They realized that for $1,996, you were getting 90% of the driving dynamics of a BMW 1600 for 60% of the price. The media quickly dubbed it the poor man's BMW. This wasn't an insult, it was the highest praise imaginable. Road and Track went as far as calling it one of the most important cars of the 20th century. The reviews shifted almost overnight from mockery to genuine fear. The 510 proved that you didn't need 400 horsepower to go fast. If you could carry 10 miles per hour more through every corner than the guy in the muscle car, you were going to beat him to the finish line. The giant killers of Trans Am? The streets were one thing. Winning stoplight drag races or carving up a canyon road is impressive. but it doesn't earn you a place in the history books. To truly kill the giant, Datsun had to do it on the world stage. They had to step into the ring of the SCCA Trans-American Championship, specifically the under 2.5-liter challenge. This wasn't a playground for economy cars. It was the stomping ground of the European aristocracy. Alfa Romeo and BMW ruled this series with iron fists, and they viewed the arrival of a Japanese sedan with the same amusement a lion might view a stray cat entering its den. Enter Pete Brock, a legendary American designer who had cut his teeth working with Carroll Shelby on the Cobra Daytona. Brock saw something in the Datsun 510 that others missed. He founded Brock Racing Enterprises, or BRE, and struck a deal with Yutaka Katayama. The mission was explicit and terrifyingly simple. Take this economy box and dismantle the reputation of the finest European racing teams in the world. They needed to change the image of Datsun in the United States forever, and they had to do it fast. The weapon of choice was the legendary number 46 car, piloted by John Morton. The construction of this machine was a study in pure, unadulterated function. There was no vanity here. The dashboard was a flat sheet of metal covered in crinkle-black paint to reduce glare. The gauges were strictly utilitarian, with a massive mechanical tachometer driven directly off the camshaft, staring John Morton in the face to remind him that the engine was screaming toward its 8,000 revolutions per minute limit. The numbers on the side of the car weren't vinyl decals or carefully stenciled graphics. They were often brushed on by hand. BRE didn't care how it looked. They only cared how it ran, and it ran like a buzzsaw. The BRE engineers took the overbuilt L-Series engine and pushed it to the absolute edge of physics. In the second season, they bored it out to 1.8 liters, fed it through massive Weber carburetors, and cranked the compression ratio up to a staggering 12.8 to 1. This transformed the humble 96 horsepower commuter engine into a fire-breathing monster, producing anywhere from 150 to 190 horsepower. In a car stripped down to roughly 1,700 pounds, that power was devastating. The 1971 season was a bloodbath. The cheap economy car proved it wasn't a fluke by taking pole position in 16 out of 19 races during its competitive life. But the true climax of this war came at the final race of the 1971 season at Laguna Seca. It was a winner-take-all showdown. To secure the manufacturer's championship for Datsun, John Morton had to beat the defending champions, Alfa Romeo. The race was chaos. The Alfa Romeo team, feeling the pressure of the upstart Japanese brand, pushed their cars to the breaking point. At the checkered flag, an Alfa Romeo technically crossed the line first. The Datsun team was crushed. It seemed the giant had survived the attack. But Pete Brock and the BRE team were suspicious. The Alfa had run the entire race at a blistering pace without stopping for fuel, a feat that mathematically shouldn't have been possible. BRE launched a protest. The technical inspectors rolled the winning Alfa into the bay and drained the fuel tank. They measured the capacity and found the smoking gun. The Alfa Romeo team had installed an illegally oversized fuel tank, a desperate cheat to avoid a mandatory pit stop. The Alfa was disqualified on the spot. Datsun was declared the winner. The championship belonged to the 510. It was a moment of absolute vindication. They hadn't just beaten the Europeans, they had scared them into cheating. BRE repeated the feat in 1972, securing back-to-back championships and cementing the Datsun 510's legacy. They proved that a cheap Japanese sedan could not only hang with the best engineering Europe had to offer, but could beat it into submission. The era of the penalty box was officially dead. The era of the sports sedan had arrived. The birth of tuner culture. The race wins proved that speed was possible, but the owners proved that the potential was infinite. Once the Datsun 510 established itself on the track, a realization swept through the automotive underground. This car was not a finished product. It was a blank canvas. The 96 horsepower rating that had once been the source of jokes was now seen for what it really was, merely a suggestion. This realization ignited a massive aftermarket movement that arguably laid the foundation for the modern tuner culture we know today. The genius of the 510 lay in what enthusiasts called the Lego factor. Nissan, in a stroke of manufacturing efficiency, had designed the L-Series engine family with remarkable interchangeability. Mechanics discovered that they could raid the Nissan parts bin to create Frankenstein monsters of performance. If the stock 1.6-liter engine felt a bit winded, you didn't need to reinvent the wheel. You could simply pull the 1.8-liter L18 or the 2.0-liter L20B from a later model truck or sedan and drop it straight in. It was plug-and-play horsepower. The motor mounts lined up, the transmission bolted on, and suddenly your commuter car had the heart of a truck and the soul of a racer. Then there was the induction noise. For any aspiring tuner in the 70s and 80s, the rite of passage was the Weber swap. The stock Hitachi carburetors were reliable, but they were designed for efficiency. Enthusiasts ripped them off and then bolted on twin Weber side draft carburetors. This didn't just unlock the engine's lung capacity, pushing horsepower from double digits well into the hundreds. It changed the sensory experience. When you opened the throttle on a Weber-fed L-Series, the sound was a guttural, mechanical roar that became the soundtrack of the import scene. The brave ones went even deeper. Because the block was so overbuilt, tuners started treating it with a level of aggression that would have shattered other engines. They bored the cylinders out to 89 millimeters to maximize displacement. They drilled out the oil jets to support high-lift camshafts that kept the valves open longer. The iron block took the abuse without complaint, proving that you could double or even triple the factory output without catastrophic failure. But power is nothing without control, and the aftermarket quickly addressed the 510's few handling quirks. When owners lowered the car to improve the center of gravity, the semi-trailing arm suspension naturally introduced aggressive negative camber. The wheels would tilt inward at the top. While this looked cool, it shredded tires. A cottage industry sprang up to solve this. Companies like Fab and Apex Engineered began producing adjustable rear crossmembers and heavy-duty mustache bars, the actual name for the support bar that held the differential. These parts allowed garage mechanics to fine-tune the suspension geometry with the precision of a race team, turning a 40-year-old chassis into a modern handling machine. This was the democratization of speed. Before the 510, high-performance handling was a luxury item reserved for those who could afford a BMW or an Alfa Romeo. The Datsun 510 changed the rules. It proved that you didn't need a trust fund to enjoy the thrill of driving. You just needed a socket set, a parts catalog, and a little bit of ambition. It created a culture of cheap thrills where the working man could build a giant killer in his own driveway. The legacy that changed everything. So, was the Datsun 510 just a cheap economy box that got lucky? No. It was the asteroid that killed the dinosaurs. Before this car arrived, made in Japan was often treated as a warning label in the automotive world. After the 510, it became a legitimate threat. This machine didn't just win a few trophies, it fundamentally legitimized an entire industry. It helped drive the market share of Japanese imports in the US from a niche 17% to nearly 30% by the end of the decade. It forced the global market to accept that engineering precision and efficiency could humiliate raw, inefficient mass. But its legacy goes deeper than sales figures. You have to remember that without the commercial and critical success of the 510, there is likely no Datsun 240Z. The dime provided the financial foundation and the brand credibility that gave Nissan the confidence to export their sports car icon to America. The 510 was the proof of concept that convinced the world Datsun wasn't just building appliances, they were building drivers' cars. Today, the 510 remains a timeless legend because it represents the ultimate victory of the underdog. It proved that fast isn't just about horsepower numbers on a brochure. It is about balance, feedback, and mechanical harmony. It taught us that 96 horsepower, when wrapped in a sophisticated chassis and a lightweight body, isn't weak. It is unstoppable. It arrived as a disposable import, but it lives on as the giant killer, proving once and for all that greatness doesn't come from size. It comes from the soul,